Okay, I'd like to call on Dr. Donna Jarrell to introduce the breakout sessions for this morning. Donna is the director of the Center for Comparative Medicine and the attending veterinarian at Mass General Hospital.
Well, thank you and good morning. I've been asked to give a little guidance for our breakout sessions before we take our break and come back together in our various locations. So we all have heard a lot about how other organizations have been able to approach evaluating and establishing performance standards, but we all know that the best way to learn is by doing. So we're going to offer our participants today an opportunity to experience the process of going through the development and implementation of a performance standard. We've divided you, all of our attendees here, as well as our online participants, into 4 groups. And we've made a concerted effort to make them very diverse. We want to make sure that all the stakeholders who are involved in this process are in your different breakout sessions. So you'll have your end users, such as your IACUC members, your scientists, your veterinarians. We'll also have representatives from the regulatory agencies in each breakout session. We will have representatives from our animal welfare organizations, here representing the public's interest, and also, whenever possible, we'll have representatives from our accreditation association of ALAC International. Those that are joining us via webcast will also have the instructions provided to you on how to participate in your group, and we will be able to take your questions online. So let's talk a little bit about the activity. The committee has chosen post-approval monitoring because it's a pretty broad theme, and what we've done is we've broken you all up into groups. And again, the goal is not to come solely to come out with a product, but to actually to come out with the experience of the process. We've had, over the past 2 days, lots of examples of how that happens, but we really want to capture the experience and reflect on that later this morning on what it means. So you have 4 different groups. You have facilitators in each of those groups, which will help you go through that. Don't worry about the topic. The topic is secondary to just going through the experience, but we've broken you into personnel training, workplace safety, the management of scientific drift, and then areas in surgical management, perioperative management. So I think our facilitators and our staff are available. So if you could come forward, we want to kind of, are they here? Come break you out into your different groups, and then I'll tell you your product. So if you have on your name tag a red sticker, after the break, you'll want to find Angela, and she will be taking us, she will be bringing us, I'm sorry, Angela. Jenna, sorry. Angela, she'll be staying here in this room. So the red group, red stickers will be staying here in this group, and you have your facilitators listed. If you're in group 2, workplace safety, you have a blue sticker. And Vanessa? Okay, so Jenna's going to take you upstairs. You will be meeting, the room that's on your program is incorrect. You'll be in room 209. And so we'll make sure that you go up. If you have a yellow sticker, Lydia will take you, and you'll be in room 106. And if you are in the 4th group, Jenna will be taking you here, and you are in room 210. So we're going to take our break, and then we're going to have you meet either in the hallway or come back here, and we will take you upstairs. And again, our online participants have instructions on how to do that. So what's your product? What's the goal? We'll give you time. We'll come back here to convene after lunch, and we will meet from just looking at coffee hour. Go ahead and do 10:15 meet, okay? And we'll break at lunch, and come back and make presentations. And each of the presentations will be 15 minutes for the 4 groups. And really, we just want to walk through what was your performance standard, what was the objective outcomes that you set, just kind of the things that you've heard in the presentations to date. And then after that, we want to come back and talk about the process and what was the experience and what were the learning points out of that. Is there any questions before we take our break in what we're going to do? Looks like everybody's ready and prepared. So we'll take our break, and then you'll go into your breakout sessions at 10:15. Thank you. Well, welcome back. I am going to facilitate the report outs from the breakout sessions, and we appreciate all of the work that you did this morning. We want to stick to the schedule. I know there was some confusion about, or an opportunity to maybe modify the schedule to allow each group to present both aspects, present their performance standard and to also present the process. But what we want to do as the working committee is to actually allow time for everyone to hear the performance standards and maybe reflect on that so that when you are actually talking about the process, if there are questions or if there's additional information that you want to think about, you'll have that time to reflect. And then after the presentations, we're going to have an opportunity to compare and contrast. And so, and hopefully identify some themes or some challenges that are consistent across the different groups. And so just to keep us on track with that plan, that's kind of why we want to stick with the schedule. But thank you for the recommendation. So I'm going to ask Group 1 to talk about their performance, their post-approval monitoring program performance standard as it relates to personnel training.
Okay, that's me. I'm going to start. I have a lot of things written down.
Would you give your name?
Oh, my name is Sandra Scherer. I'm from the Feinstein Institute in New York. I have a lot of things written down, and I hope I captured what the group discussed. So if there's other things that I'm missing, if everybody could fill in as I'm finishing or going along if I'm missing anything. But the first thing I want to identify who our stakeholders are. And we all agreed that our stakeholders are the IACUC, the IO, the animal care staff, and the researchers. So that's a wide group of people that we're covering for training. Why is a performance standard needed for this topic? We all felt that proper and consistent training equals successful science and good animal welfare practices across the board. And we need to document the abilities of our staff and the researchers to do good science. What are our objectives and our desired outcomes for our performance standards? We have consistency, competency, and proficiency. We want to create engineering standards, which would be required for regulatory and accreditation programs. And we want to create performance standards which equal clear, concise curriculum and have good quality of training needs to be defined. Our criteria for measurement, some of the things that I have notes here on are that we have a good post-procedural monitoring program in place, and that would be for the animal care staff and the researchers as part of training to make sure that we follow up on experiments and that people understand what the follow-up process is. And that ensures animal welfare. To have a good post-approval monitoring program in place. Consistent feedback loops from people to people in the facility, people that are in the facility, the researchers to be able to communicate effectively. Verification of competency. Good documentation of training and effective documentation of training. That we can share our documentation, that it's clear and concise. And also reviewing of undesirable outcomes before they happen. This way we're not measuring only on the reporting of negative outcomes, that we can get to those before they happen. And that comes with a good rigorous training program. So for an assessment plan, how do we assess that our training is working? We want to track compliance. And we want to have a good plan for reassessment and retraining to make sure that if we find deficits, that we can pick up where we left off and keep going. Provide an actual certificate to our trainees so they can take this with them along the way, wherever they may go. A system of self-review and self-reporting. We want people to feel confident that they can come forward with their questions or concerns about training, or if they're having problems. To document all training, including documenting competency. Didactic review, to be able to identify individual needs in a group, and that's part of the assessment, pre-assessment before training. And to document the trainer's training. This way we can assess their improvements or decline over time. Does anybody have anything to add? Am I missing anything so far from our group? Our action plan. So how do we put together all the pieces of what our training program needs? We have a definite need is train the trainer program. I think we all agreed on that. We have a teaching component, a training component, which is the hands-on learning, and to be able to separate training levels within our groups. And then we have to have an assessment window. How do we assess what we did with all of these different stages? And then from the assessment window, do we approve people to work, or do we require more training? And when do we offer refresher courses? Point 6 is schedule and method for implementation. We all agreed that you need training programs and dedicated trainers or training coordinators. And this varies between facility size, how big your program is, and the needs of your program. Smaller facilities might not need that many resources, but bigger places definitely do. To plan out your resources ahead of time, space and materials, structured program and training modules, didactic and hands-on components, and to bring in the experts to cover specialized needs, or what we called role-based needs, to have active learning and good follow-up outcome measures. Point 7 is to describe potential limitations in the performance standards that your group developed. We have a good list here. It's resource intensive. It does require a team effort. And how much is budgeted into people's programs ahead of time? Is the money there, or the resources there? And when do we dip into those resources to be focused on other things when problems arise in the facility? We have the interesting dichotomy of lab staff versus animal care staff. I think that comes up a lot. And we really don't want the report outs of progress of failures to drive training program and training needs. And this isn't the best measure or metric of good training. Also, there's a lot of time that needs to be committed to a rigorous training program. And one more point is cultural alignment, is to take everybody from all different places and to get them on the same page and create the same vision from everybody across the board. I hope that captures what our group discussed. And Bruce will be next.
Yeah, thank you. I like that comment about failure should not drive your training program. So we will go on now before we get back to the reflection phase and have the workplace safety post-approval monitoring program presented.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Disco from the University of Michigan. I'm representing the Blue Group that took care of the issue on workplace safety and how that would be looked at in a post-approval monitoring situation. Our stakeholders would be the same as Group 1, except we would also then add to that the occupational health group and the environmental health group from the institutions. And one of the things we learned is that some institutions have them as separate entities and some institutions have them as the same entity, and so that adds a level of complexity. So why would a performance standard be needed? So what we were looking at was we needed an appropriate program to review the program of workplace safety. And what we tried to do was focus on post-approval monitoring and the review of the investigator laboratory project arena, recognizing though that the semi-annual review of the entire program is a very key part of the performance standard in reviewing occupational health and safety. That'll somewhat come up again as I talk. The object or the desired outcome, we were looking at percent enrollment in the occupational safety program, looking at assurances of training and documentation of competency. We're going to look at minimal and acceptable levels of workplace injury and identification and management of hazards at the laboratory site. Criteria for measurement would be adherence to occupational environmental health standards, tracking of any incidents and exposures that occurred, providing a basic set of questions for the post-approval monitors, which would include open-ended questions for the laboratory staff so that they could discuss what was going on in the laboratory without being led point by point from the protocol that was approved, and also an effort to discover their knowledge of the occupational safety program and the consequences if they do not follow the occupational safety program. And the fourth criteria for measurement was visual evaluation of the animal laboratory space. The assessment plan, now we were looking at the assessment plan from the sort of view of the Animal Care and Use Committee. And so we would be expecting timely reports to the committee of occupational safety related incidents, and that these should be a component of regularly scheduled meetings, and that there would also be reports to the committee and to the IO via the semi-annual report, and that would involve gathering information from all involved program components. So we would be looking to get information that would be maintained by environmental health, by occupational safety, by the animal care program, et cetera. The action plan, we would be looking to follow up any incidents that were reported for retraining, lockout from the animal facility, or any other activity that would be done to try and make sure that the laboratory got into compliance. We talked about a possible tiered assessment such that there might be increased post-approval monitoring visits to areas in which there was increased risk or increased indications of noncompliance. And we felt that it was important to identify who had to be involved in the resolution process. So going back to the stakeholders, which pieces of that set of groups would be involved in the remediation. For schedule and method of implementation, following along, we'd be looking at monthly and semi-annual notification of incidents and issues. And one of the things that came up was that big changes at the institution might require extra opportunities for addressing occupational safety and workplace safety compliance. Some of these included acquisitions of a new company for those in the commercial sector, introductions of new species. If suddenly you now had non-human primates where you didn't have any before, that might be a good opportunity to look at that. And also if there's going to be large changes in personnel. The example was the sociology of companies in which there is an expected decrease in workforce, that oftentimes the adherence to safety standards and other standards starts to drop, and that may be a opportunity of time at which the institution needs to look closely. The limitations that we identified, the strength of the occupational health and the environmental health programs, And we noted that the strength could be a problem or a limitation if it was both too high or too low, and their level of partnership with the animal care program. The accuracy of reporting issues and exposures was a big limitation. A lot of this is based on the starting point that if something happens, it follows through the chain of being considered an occupational health exposure, the person going to the physician, et cetera. And if that doesn't happen, it becomes difficult to know if that's a potential problem. Lack of resources, both money and labor being the primary two to consider, and then the level of institutional support could also be a limitation. Thank you.
So, Judy.
Continue on.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Just
Oh.
introduce your name.
Kent Lloyd and Judy MacArthur Clark, and we were assigned the task by our group, number 3, to represent this topic, and the topic was scientific flexibility in animal use protocols, and parenthetically, study drift. And I think this was a pretty interesting topic for us, number one, because, and compared to the other 3 topics in which those 3 topics were clearly identified and discussed within the guide. This particular topic area isn't really directly identified in the guide. In fact, when we went to the guide and looked for the word drift, it doesn't appear anywhere. And then in terms of flexibility, that word appears only 5 times and has nothing to do with scientific research or progress. So I think we were throwing a curveball on this one, which actually resulted in good discussion. And I think the lesson for us was that you first have to define terms, because we had representatives around the table from all the stakeholders. I think we were just missing representatives of regulators like AwAr, USDA, or the accrediting bodies. But the rest of us were all there, from scientists, veterinarians to others. And so I think what that did is taught us was the fact that you really need to have a good discussion in terms of what we were defining and talking about. So we went everything from first discussing what drift is versus flexibility, and then taking another tack at it, looking at maybe, well, let's assign it as predictable versus non-predictable outcomes. Ultimately, we decided that drift is a natural occurrence of science, but eventually it can cross over into quote-unquote non-compliance when you look at an IACUC protocol. So with that as the basis, we then started the discussions to give it a structure, and the structure was basically focused on protecting and promoting animal welfare, and also looking at how we can reduce administrative and the unnecessary bureaucratic burden. And I point out the unnecessary part because one of our participants, Paul Locke, pointed out that in the absence of bureaucracy is chaos. And of course, we don't want to go there. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Judy.
So I think actually we're misbehaving because we're kind of doing our dual presentation here. But anyway, it was quite a complex conversation that we were having. Oh, and there was a regulator there, because I guess I'm a regulator, but it's a different regulatory system. Okay. So as Kent has said, we were kind of looking at, well, what is the problem here? And the problem we defined was that there's a tendency for investigators to go outside the terms of their authorizations, because their authorizations are so tightly constructed, and therefore they've either got to go back to the IACUC to get amendment, which might be a very trivial amendment, pretty meaningless type of amendment, and instead of doing that, they tend to kind of just say, well, we'll do it anyway, and maybe we'll get away with it, and we'll tell them at the annual post-approval monitoring what we did. And that was the closest we could get to the guide, that mention in post-approval monitoring, where in fact it talks about prospective changes as opposed to changes you've already implemented. So the fundamental thing that we thought was that actually this is solved by having more flexibility. What the reaction of IACUCs has tended to be, we'll buckle them down even tighter in order to deal with this problem. But the reality is that the problem needs solving by more flexibility in protocols, provided that doesn't compromise animal welfare. So the performance standard we were looking for was, the performance standard we felt was needed was flexibility, but within that flexibility, it would be flexibility which would allow science to evolve, which would avoid the unnecessary bureaucracy that my colleagues already talked about, and that would protect animal welfare. So those were sort of three key criteria that we put into that. And we felt that actually this was more than just this performance standard. It was about changing culture, changing behavior. So it's not just changing the behavior of the IACUC, but it's also changing the behavior of the people applying for their protocols, the investigators, and so on. It's about a whole culture change within the institution. What's the object of it and desired outcome? The objective is that all research should be appropriately authorized and reviewed, but that actually the IACUC should recognize that flexibility is needed. And they should only refuse flexibility if there is a grounds for doing so on the basis of animal welfare. In other words, if you say, well, actually, I think I might want to do 4 blood draws, but I might occasionally need to do 6 of them, then if the IACUC takes the view there's a significant difference for the welfare of the animal between 4 and 6, then yes, they might only authorize 4. But if they take the view, which is probably more likely, that it really doesn't matter too much, they might say, well, up to 6 is authorizable. We expect you to do the minimum number because that's the minimum intrusion on the animal, but actually, if you need to go to 6, we still think that 6 is justified for the purpose that you've come to us to seek this approval. So that's a kind of background to where our thinking was coming from. So this is a program that we're talking about doing. Okay, this is not just a sort of simple change what the IACUC does. So there's a whole piece around this, and we talked about creating a toolbox of things, one of which is training the IACUC to think around this different way of how they can manage and control the things that they're authorizing and not letting go of everything. And also training applicants to think about how they can word their protocols in such a way that they're not asking for the world, they're asking for realistic things that they need to do, but they're asking it in such a way that they don't say, I will always inject 5 mils, if sometimes you might want to inject 7 mils or even 10 mils, and that doesn't make any difference to the welfare of the animal. Or not just saying, I will always use intravenous. If you know that sometimes, or maybe you might just sometimes want to do intraperitoneal or subcutaneous. So that's where we were coming from. Criteria for measurement on this program, we thought that one way of measuring this would be around how many trivial amendments are being effectively nodded through by the IACUC. Because if that's happening frequently, then there's something wrong with what they're initially authorizing. If they don't have to stop and think about the amendment, then it probably didn't need to be an amendment in the first place. It could have been put in the protocol at the outset. So that was one of them. But also looking at the other side of it, how many violations are taking place, how many non-compliances, and thinking about those, we were quite concerned to understand what type of non-compliances, particularly which ones are kind of really just technical. There's no welfare issue. We had an example of an anesthetized rabbit that was having blood taken from it, and the protocol said that it would be collected by cardiac puncture, but in fact the investigators found it was much easier to do a draw on the aorta, abdominal aorta. No difference at all to the animal, but because they'd written up cardiac puncture in their protocol, they were in breach. And that's what we might call a technical breach, and going back to the IACUC to get that amended was kind of a challenge. And those would be different from the breaches which are when the whole thing is getting out of hand and the investigator thinks he can gaily just carry on and do whatever he fancies doing because he's got the authorization from the IACUC, even though what he's doing isn't included in the authorization. Note, I'm always using the male, but that applies to males and females. Okay. Okay, and we were also going to look at the number of interventions by attending veterinarians because that we thought that that would be an interesting criteria to measure. So how were we going to go about doing this and assessing it? We felt that there was a real scope here for using some technology like surveys of the type of SurveyMonkey type of thing, where you can readily get surveys out to widespread people throughout the community. And we thought that all of those who were affected, and that might include non-scientific staff in the institution who might have a view about this. So I should also say we were also going to have a launch program for it. We felt that this is something that it's incumbent on the IACUC to explain to the institution why they're taking this new approach and how it's going to work and how they're going to continue to have good control over the welfare of animals and so on. So there's explaining why it's being done, maybe a pre-survey to understand where the gap analysis is, but not all places would need to do that, and using surveys of the SurveyMonkey type to also get feedback. So I think I'm into action plan, assessment plan. I'm not sure where I am at the moment, but it's all part of it, okay? So, and the survey would not just be, well, has the IACUC reduced the time it spends on reviewing amendments by 50% over the last 12 months? That might be part of it, but also the survey would embrace things like, do the animal care staff say, actually, and as a consequence of this, the PIs are talking to us more about what's going on and the welfare of their animals and so on? Or are they saying, you know what, it's chaos in the animal unit now because nobody knows how to control. So all these different opinions you could pull in from the SurveyMonkey to know whether the whole of the program is working well and whether the performance right across the program is working well. So we thought that was really important. Coming back then, training of the IACUC we thought was important because, and I brought some personal experience to this because we've gone through something similar to this in the UK over the last sort of 5 years or so, and actually training my inspectors to not want absolutely detailed, precise protocols for everything, but to allow that flexibility in protocols. It's been a journey for them, and it's a journey for applicants as well. And so there's a training on all sides, and I think from my perspective, and everybody supported that there was a need for that. We're saying this needs to be done at an institutional level because some institutes may be already quite far down this path and others may be way up at the other end of the spectrum. And I guess that's part of the surveys to find out where you are. And there's a bit of benchmarking around this as well. Not sure how that would get done. But anyway, this is going to be institutional. What are the limitations? Flexibility may be seen as liberty. So there has to be something that explains, and that's part of the launch process. This is not liberalization. This is about some pragmatic flexibility. Or one member of our group pointed out that the PIs may aim to go for excessively complex protocols, trying to get everything in to a single protocol so it covers everything. So we need the IACUC to be able to push back on that. That was potentially a limitation of it. And also institutions may feel they've got to do the whole package, but actually we felt that this was kind of like a toolbox that we would be creating, would be designing, and it's for the individual IACUC to determine how they implement that toolbox, which tools out of the toolbox they need to use. And I think at the end of the day then, in terms of post-approval monitoring and ongoing review, this would be quite easy to sort of do further surveys over time and make sure that you are staying on track, you weren't verging too far one way or another, but just monitoring that. We felt that you could focus on quantitative, like these numbers of non-compliances and so on, and that would be important to do, but you might well get more information out of getting people's more qualitative views about how well is this working and how well does it help me as a scientist to deliver my science, me as an animal care person to ensure the animals are well cared for, me as a veterinarian to ensure that I am having the input that I need to have and so on. And me as an IACUC member to feel I'm actually spending my time doing important things instead of wasting my time processing trivial amendments. I think that's where we got to. So that's our process. Okay.
Thank you. I think emphasizing the communication piece was a big key part of when you make change and making sure everybody understands the change. So our last group has exceeded expectations and has actually put together a PowerPoint. And so we're going to have them come forward.
So I'm Randy Nelson, and I'd like to apologize for the group of overachievers that we were saddled with. Angela, if you could pull up our presentation, and could I have it on the, oh, thank you, on the little vanity thing here. And given my bifocals, I'll try to use this as a template. As I said, we had a group of overachievers. We were essentially set in a spoke of a wheel, and this spoke was the consideration of perioperative surgical management, and we went down several of the hub rather, we went down several of the spokes before we finally got back to the center and got on topic. If I can have the next slide, please. The first thing we did was we asked, why are we developing a standard in the first place? And our problem, we realized after doing some very quick searches, was that the guide and the regulations were nonspecific with regard to several of the key elements that we were interested in discussing. So we decided one of the things we had to do is perhaps provide some necessary specifics, and we were going to do that to ensure consistency in our program. This hypothetical program that we're talking about. And we wanted to also provide a mechanism for protocol flexibility, which many of us have talked about already, because you need that flexibility when addressing unexpected outcomes. These outcomes may or may not affect the animal, and they probably affect the science, and we'd like to be able to respond to both of those things. If I may have the next slide, please. So after discussing why, we tried to come up with some objectives. Our aim was not quite as good as this little illustration over in the right-hand part of the slide, but we did think that we needed to ensure that animals were going to be handled appropriately. Obviously, we wanted to minimize pain and distress, and one way to do that was to have some consistent standards for evaluating investigator performance. By reducing variability, we get better science, and we know that. And we also wanted to make sure that we would be achieving, we the investigators or the investigators that we're monitoring, achieving the planned protocol outcomes. So the final thing that we thought was desirable was to assess the competency of individuals that are being monitored. Oftentimes we educate didactically and then expect them also to have competency and the appropriate skills to do the study, and that probably requires a lot more oversight than many of our institutions are currently doing. So we thought education and several other things would lead to consistent and competent execution of the research plan as approved by the IACUC. And of course the stakeholders in all of this have been mentioned before, but the one stakeholder our group of stakeholders we haven't mentioned are the animals. And so we were very, very concerned about the animals and making sure that we had that balance between the best science and the best animal welfare that we could achieve. Next slide, please. So our measurements. Well, we started thinking about who and what we were going to measure. Well, we're going to measure personnel, and we need to understand not only what they're doing, but what their needs are. Of course, there are some species-specific concerns, which is not easy to say quickly, but there certainly is something that we must consider, and equipment, space, and special other concerns entered into our discussion, as did observational intervals and the intensity of observation. We discussed monitoring by trained personnel. Certainly lots of people can monitor, but if they're not appropriately trained to assess at the same time, then the question becomes, is the monitoring actually effective? And the review of experimental design by both those doing the experiments and by the people observing them is probably important and should be done together so that that parallel examination of what was originally approved can be refined if necessary and adhered to because it's necessary. Next slide, please. We continued on considering things that we might want to measure, and we knew that protocols should incorporate flexibility, so the things that we should be measuring is our adherence to such things as ranges and options that are explicitly stated in the protocol. And some of the messages that we shared with each other included messages about making sure that protocols are written broadly enough to account for some of the flexibility needed in any scientific experiment. Now, I'm not suggesting, as I think Judy suggested, that one would want to write an omnibus protocol, because those are just fraught with not only complexity but danger in terms of walking a fine line between compliance and non-compliance. We were trying to determine how we would account for the known possible adverse outcomes and provide mechanisms to deal with them in the protocol. Because if we can do that, if we can predict, then protocols are not rate limiting, but rather they're flexible enough to account for this. And of course, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Animal health assessment perioperatively, and especially preoperatively, we thought was important. Animals' condition, we thought, must be reasonable for surgery, and we wondered whether too often animals were not appropriately worked up, shall we say, to determine whether surgery was a good idea at any given point in time, and that might include making sure that the acclimation has been appropriate. We talked about anesthesia and analgesia, and we wanted to make sure that the use was as planned and executed per protocol. Next slide, please. So in terms of implementation, we thought that there needed to be a formal review process and a timeline, including activities and assessment of outcomes, both positive and those, I'm not going to use the word negative, but I'll use requiring refinement. We wanted to track surgical outcomes so that if there were problems, we could identify them, determine what procedures ought to be included for subsequent modification to ensure that animal welfare and good science, again, were paramount. And so we started talking about a checklist as a tool for us to use to verify adherence to protocols. The protocols themselves kind of drive the checklist. They're the framework. But we wanted to make sure that we protected every intentional and non-intentional deviation, or at least projected them, so that we knew what the IACUC had approved and what it hadn't. And we talked about audit processes, focusing attention on both planned and unplanned outcomes. And then a miracle occurred. As if by magic, one of our listeners typed in a very, very long comment, which was just absolutely excellent, and we will conclude this presentation with that. And then, as if another miracle was going to occur, we received a checklist from this post-approval monitor. And we thought, aha, we have been just given all of the things that we need to do. So we were going to go to lunch, but we decided that we probably better stick it out. And so we went to the next slide. We went to there we go. And we looked at this checklist, and there were wonderful things on this checklist. And so, talking about protocol, personnel, study procedures, I don't expect you to be able to read this because I certainly can't from here. But all of the entries in this checklist were basically what we would have liked to have put down had we had the time and a much better computer than the one we used. And so we have to thank this participant who said we could name her, but we're not gonna, because we thought that would be favoritism. And we don't want to have any conflict of interest here, but the take-home message from something like this is don't reinvent the wheel. Before you try to make performance standards, go out and see what's out there. And if the whole idea that we're going to discuss at the end of this meeting is sharing of these performance standards, maybe we just did that, or maybe we had somebody do it for us. Next slide, please. So, methods of implementation. We wanted to make sure that we came up with a way for checking appropriate postoperative conditions, for example, during recovery, and then made sure that who was ever monitoring these animals did so at regular intervals as necessary to ensure the minimization of pain and distress. And that's going to have to be worked out on a case-by-case basis because the species involved and the time to recovery is going to be different. We wanted to ensure that investigator involvement was part of this monitoring process. And that may be through surrogates like laboratory personnel, but it should be encouraged to actually be those people who designed the experiments themselves. Next slide, please. So when we got to limitations, we tried to resist the idea of talking about known knowns and unknown knowns and known unknowns and things of that sort, because we're not Donald Rumsfeld. But we did realize that this was an opportunity. When one looks at limitations, it's an opportunity to look at it not only across a particular protocol, but across the entire program. And if you start to see patterns through trend analysis, you know that something has to be fixed, not only in that particular situation, but across your entire program. So post-approval monitoring, especially when it comes to perioperative management, can be extremely important in raising the standards and minimizing pain and distress. This should involve lots of people, not just laboratory folks, but also staff, IACUC members, and compliance office, but you got to make sure that there's availability. If you do post-approval monitoring without the right folks on the team, the possibility is that you might strike out. So we also discussed the fact that during this sort of thing, procedures had to be worked out to determine exactly what was going to happen if the deviations that sometimes occur and sometimes are observed warranted reporting. So there should be a well-defined procedure for disseminating information internally and reporting externally. Next slide. So in summary, I want to bring to your attention this wonderful message that one of our participants in the webinar sent us. And paraphrasing that, she basically said the goals of PAM are to ensure that the protocol is being carried out as the IACUC understood and approved it. And I would underline understood. The protocol itself must be the framework for the evaluation used on a checklist, and the checklist is basically the tool. And in addition, the monitor can also ensure that approved protocol procedures, in this case perioperative, also adhere to regulations, policy, and the guide. So that's all, folks. Thank you.
I think all four groups have demonstrated a lot of thinking and a lot of effort in a very short period of time over a topic that is mentioned, as you said, in the guide, but beyond that, it's really left to a lot of interpretation. So thank you for that. What we want to do now is just kind of reflect a little bit more and get any comments you may have. And I appreciate if it was difficult to split these off, but maybe even reiterate what the process felt like, or what was involved in the process of developing the performance standards, whether we say challenges, opportunities. Just reflect on that, each group, starting with group one.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bruce Kennedy from Cal Poly Pomona, and hello to those of you that are listening in. And I'm sorry that you couldn't listen in on our particular session, because we were in the large room here and we decided as part of our process to group ourselves around the table in order that we could look at each other face to face, kind of like a convened IACUC meeting. So we introduced ourselves and identified what our stakes were as stakeholders in the process. Our item was personnel training in animal handling and procedures, and we recognized that in some way each one of us was a trainer. We may not have had the direct responsibility to be doing training of those in our institutions, but certainly we had some role in what we were doing as stakeholders in the training responsibilities and obligations of our institutions. So David Anderson and Marianne Vassbinder were the coordinators for the session, and they kept us online. We would deviate a little bit and every so often pull us back in to whatever the topics were that we were discussing at that point. But it was meant to be rather flexible, and while we had an agenda and we had a defined period of time in which to get something accomplished, we were allowed to free think and reflect upon our own institutions, what we knew about, what we didn't know about, what we thought would be beneficial in incorporating into our own training programs as we were trying to define both performance standards and to some degree engineering standards. The biggest stakeholder here is the animal, of course. So if we're looking at goal number one, which is why is a performance standard even needed for this topic, obviously it's about the welfare of the animal and getting what we need from that animal in a means that considers welfare. So that's our primary goal, and the animal is integral to the whole thing. So coming back from that, we identified that we needed to understand the culture of training. We discussed the culture of our institutions. How is it that we would imbue and convey what was important about training? We reflected on that a little bit from each institution. And each of us needed to buy into that culture. It needed to come from the top down, as we recognized at one point. It wasn't just what was being trained within cage wash or in the surgical unit or in the animal holding room and so forth. We all needed to recognize that culture was important for training, and we would contribute our ideas and how we were doing that. We also recognized that there were some minimum expectations because the stakeholders at the table were regulatory. There are the things in the guide that were necessary, and Marianne paraphrased several sections out of the guide, and Dr. Gibbons from the USDA quoted from the Animal Welfare Act regulations what our expectations were, but we also recognize that it was kind of free language and not very well defined, and that's obviously the reason for having a performance standard. So we were looking at a little bit more. We created some frameworks. We filled them in a little bit. We brought in our experiences, our home office, meaning where we worked, experiences to contribute to the idea, to share our expectations. We wanted to promote the concepts of training and whatever that standard would be, and whatever the necessary items were that we had to take care of. We were concerned about what the documentation was, what kind of evidence, what was a learning management system, for example. We were worrying about competency and measures of ability to complete something after being trained. And that meant we had to have competent trainers as well as competent trainees. We recognized there needed to be some sort of train-the-trainer program. So that's something that we discussed. We talked about rubrics and what it meant to have good surgical models or good cage changing processes. Whatever it may have been, how do we evaluate the competency of an individual once he or she had been trained? So rubrics are important. We discussed a little bit about measures. How could we say that, oh, we are trained, we know what to do? What started out to be kind of negative, punitive even, and even looking at what needed to happen with human resources if someone didn't have what is called maybe the ABCs, the attitude and the behavior and the cognition about some aspect of training. Well, punitive was kind of a negative term, and Randy, as you just said, requiring refinements to put it into a different light, if you will. So we wanted to promote the concept of training, and how do we do that? When ALAC comes in, some of us have a look at the training records. How many people are certified by ALAS at any one of the levels? How much do people go off to meetings, and do they do this just before a particular activity, or is the culture of training something that we kept returning to very many times? Is that culture there? Is it evident that we are supportive in our institutions of whatever the training may be? So these are measures of training and measures of accomplishment in a more positive way. But on the negative side, when we're recognizing that something has gone wrong, we started saying, oh, that's when we needed to put more resources into some problem, some challenge that had just happened in our training program. Let's say a whole line of mice died, or surgical procedures were failing, a lot of infection as a result. So we brought in the concept of, well, we need some insurance. Training is like an insurance, that we need to have it there all the time, and we want to utilize it at some point. So we discussed around that a little bit. There's several models here, as you can tell, and that helped to appreciate what the performance standard would be ultimately, how it would become evident. So I brought in the concept of, how about driving? And that's outside of what it means to be in a lab animal facility. When we're driving something, maybe a little car in our backyard, and then we need to go onto the road, we go to driver's training school, and then we get assessed, and we receive a license, and we go back every 4 years. There's a cop on the road, and occasionally we drive too fast. All of these we can substitute training with some, substitute the word driving with some aspect of training within the institution. And while we are all different stakeholders with different impressions and different expectations out of training, we are all drivers, and so that would level our field, and we could consider that as a model of a way to develop our own performance standards. It became very evident that our models were uniquely identified to our institutions. So therefore, as Neil Lippin brought up, we needed to talk about role-based situations, because someone is a surgeon, someone is a cage washer, or someone is a cage changer. We needed to develop standards of training for the person based upon his or her job in some way. That related to how often does someone need to be trained. So we just discussed the time factor, every month, every week, every year, something like that. We recognize that training, coming back and forth through the discussion, is very resource intensive. We needed to have resources like people, trainers that had proven their own competency, and how do we know that the trainers are good? There are outside individuals that we can hire in to be trainers in the institution. We discussed that a little bit. There's other aspects of the resources. Do we have budgetary lines in our institutions to purchase equipment, to send people to meetings, to show videos, to buy ALAS training manuals, to pay for certification examinations and so forth? All of this is very difficult as a process. We kept coming back to the question, so how do we know that we've been trained? What is that point? Well, training is a lifelong venture. We're always learning in some way. And it isn't something that we accomplish on Friday and forget about it until Monday morning again. We're always there and looking at it. So there has to be some sort of oversight. Who contributes to that? Inspections, accreditations, semi-annuals, hammers. We discuss each of those other persons that are stakeholders in the process of developing performance standards for the training aspect. We recognize that training is a challenge for everybody. We are adult learners at this point, and in our school systems, we have training challenges there as well as we're promoting a child from one grade level to the next one. We recognize that there's some drift and some slippage. So we have concrete training processes here. Well, next year may need to be different because of a change in regulation, change in research, some way that would influence what we needed to establish as our levels of competency and the way that we evaluated trainees in our training programs. So for all of that, all of these concepts that were bounced around, and we would constantly be brought back into, well, okay, how do we develop the standard of performance in terms of training? That's what it meant for us, really.
Thank you for highlighting the complexity of making a product live, and appreciate that. Go ahead to group 2. Bob?
So instead of a PowerPoint, group 2 put together a music video of our response, if you could. So the first point to make is that the group diversity aspect was very important and was an awesome part of it. In ours, where we were looking at occupational safety, we recognized we had representatives from large institutions, small institutions, academia, commercial representatives, and all of us had a very unique take on what was going on with the challenges of occupational safety that didn't always match the person sitting next to us. And I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind, in the fact that when tackling these issues, we need to think about casting the net pretty broadly for people to bring in, especially when you're at the brainstorming phase, so that you can get as many different viewpoints and aspects around the issue as possible. And it may even be worth bringing people from outside your institution in, because they will also then have perspectives that nobody in your institution would have. So I thought that was a very enlightening aspect of this. Just to point out how diverse this group was, we had John, our wildlife expert, in with us, and at one point when we were a little off tangent, he pointed out that aerial darting of wildlife from a helicopter was one of the easier protocols to evaluate for occupational safety. And that, of course, couldn't resonate at all with the rest of us, since we don't even have any protocols that have a helicopter in them. So, the one thing that Bruce pointed out, I want to repeat, is that oftentimes we would go on a tangent. We would start free thinking and start talking about things. It was very good to have Donna and David in our case, but in any case, when you're doing something like this, in your brainstorming, someone to bring you back to center, someone that brings you back and says, okay, we've got to remember that we're focusing on the assessment portion here or something else. But we were able to still keep in mind what got discussed during those tangents, and I think that's also very educational part of the process that we don't want to just totally remove by having somebody rigidly follow along the list of to-dos. We noted a couple of challenges as we were working through the process, one of which was to remember that we were focusing on post-approval monitoring. As I pointed out, one of the things that came up was how much the semi-annual evaluation, how important that would be as part of the biosafety and workplace safety assessments. And so sometimes we would start focusing really on what would be more appropriately dealt with in the semi-annual, and we had to remind ourselves to come back and focus on post-approval monitoring. Another interesting aspect of our situation was we were involving occupational health or environmental health into our process, and I don't think that was, for some of the other challenges, there wasn't that external body that was an important part of it outside of the IACUC and the animal care group and the investigators and the animals. I mean, that was sort of the core for the other three, but we had this additional piece that was quite a variable because of the differences between all the institutions. And that was something we had to keep in mind as we talked about involving them, was recognizing that in some cases their involvement would be a plus or a minus depending on the circumstances. When we got to the assessment plan, one of the things we tended to focus on a little bit for a while was how the post-approval monitor would be assessing the workplace safety. And we came to the realization after talking a bit that it was really, we were at the point where the IACUC was going to be assessing the post-approval monitoring process for occupational safety. And we had to remember to bring ourselves back to that. So it was, again, good to talk about the one, but recognize that the objective was the other. Bruce mentioned culture at the institution. That came up in our discussion, that a lot of what we're talking about, especially as we're talking about making changes, has to do with not only some things that might be put on paper, but also changing the culture of an institution. Does your institution have a very heavy occupational safety and compliance culture? Does it have a very benign culture? And as you're moving in a different direction, what's that going to take? And then the last thing to mention was, as Randall pointed out, the knowing the unknowns and all that sort of stuff. That's a challenge for the occupational safety issue, because oftentimes we have to rely on what's happened on the ground to trickle all the way up through the process so that it hits a point that's identifiable and that you can keep track of it. And depending on the institution, sometimes that was 1 or 2 steps up, sometimes that was 4 or 5 steps up. But in order to really keep tabs on what's going on for occupational and workplace safety at your institution, you're going to need to be able to try and capture as many of those things as close to the trenches as possible. And again, that may come to education of the staff so that they recognize the importance of following through with reporting and seeing the physician, et cetera, so that those things will be taken care of.
Well, for group number 3, there's not a whole lot to add to what we already did, but I do want to say that I think what we felt in our group were, again, similar themes that have already presented from group 1 and 2. The diversity, again, was very, very important. As I mentioned, we had scientists, we had veterinarians, we had even legal representation. We had scientists with a veterinary background, veterinarians with a scientific background, and scientists who wanted to be or had legal background. So we had just about everything that you could imagine. And that was actually then displayed in the level of intent on trying to define exactly what our topic was, as I mentioned already. But in general, I mean, the overall perspective was one of general interest and earnestness to try to identify the need for performance standards around this topic. And certainly, clearly, the motivation was to do the right thing. I think one of the things that we identified was that because our particular topic was really focused on the protocol itself, when you talk about scientific drift off the protocol, someone mentioned the conflict between where the guide has moved from based on engineering standards to performance standards. The protocol, by definition, is the closest thing that you can get to an engineering standard in terms of citing specific numbers and very, very detailed items. So we're trying to apply a performance standard to those things that are inherently associated with something that is really related to the very details of the procedures itself. And that was the reason for spending so much time on that. But I think it was time well spent because that allowed then the rest of the discussion to proceed pretty successfully. Judy?
Yeah, as Kent says, I think a lot has already been said. I guess the few things I'd like to add to that, the focus, I think, on post-approval monitoring for our group was that we saw post-approval monitoring as an opportunity not so much to check whether or not people had complied with their protocol, because we felt that we should assume people were complying with their protocols. But actually, it's an opportunity for learning, and it's a learning for everybody involved. And the IACUC serves a purpose in terms of, well, what have we learned from this protocol that we can apply to other protocols that come to us? And what have we learned in terms of the flexibility that we've empowered within this process, and how can we kind of moderate that as well? And we were thinking of using the semi-annual or annual reviews to kind of make time points at which that could be considered. I think we did have a real problem as a group working out what the performance standard was, because we couldn't kind of get our heads around it. We knew what we were talking about was really important, but trying to home it in on a performance standard was, I think, quite challenging for us. And I wonder, therefore, whether we need to think about that terminology, because it took us most of our hour and a half or whatever we had to kind of really be confident this was a performance standard that we were working on. And I wonder whether there's a different, to us, I think we felt it was more about, this is thinking about performance and the processes that go into performance, as opposed to a performance standard, which somehow feels like you should have an engineering standard and a performance standard and compare the two together. So maybe there's a bit of taxonomy that we want to think about here in terms of opening this up a bit more. Because having heard the other groups as well, I think the same probably applied in those areas as well. But certainly in ours, we struggled with the term performance standard. Definitely strength of having a diverse group. We, I think, identified, and Donna, you've mentioned this, the opportunity that this gives to, as you think about performance, how you perform under the legislation, there are immense opportunities to communicate that, not just within your immediate community, but within others in the institution, whatever your institution may be. I mean, obviously in a thoughtful way, but I think all the things that we've heard from the front here today that everybody throughout the room has generated have been real opportunities to communicate how responsibly animal research is conducted. And that's a message that I don't think always gets across. So I thought that there was that as well. And there was one message, I think, which we came to quite clearly, coming back to our own particular topic, which was we came to the view that you couldn't have grey areas around whether somebody had complied or not complied with their protocol. Because as soon as you have grey areas, you'll start the slippery slope, and then, well, if you're allowed to do that, a different route of administration, even though your protocol doesn't allow it, it's not really a non-compliance, because, well, where does that slippery slope go to? And some will take more advantage of that slippery slope than others. And so we felt it was absolutely important to maintain that black and white. What does your protocol permit? What doesn't it permit? And you may say, yes, you were non-compliant, but actually there were no welfare consequences, and therefore we're going to consider that to be a technical breach, but you still need to give the message to the investigator that they had failed to comply with their protocol, because unless you hold that firm line, then the whole thing becomes too vague, and it verges towards what Paul Locke called chaos. If there's no bureaucracy at all, we end up in chaos. So I think that was quite an important decision for us to make as a group, before we then went on to saying, well, therefore, we need to allow more flexibility within the protocol so they're still compliant with the protocol when they make sensible decisions about what can be done alternatively. I don't know whether others in our group have anything they want to add to any of that.
Great. Just, I mean, there's so much, I'm sure, a lot of conversations going on in your head, and we're going to be excited to move on. But we'll let the last group, if you have anything else you want to add on the process.
Please don't hate me. May I have the next slide, please? No, I'm not kidding. Honestly, we have a second one. Yes, thank you very much. But it's only one slide, I promise. In some instances, we had a very diverse group. In other instances, all the diversity was already used up by the time it got to group 4. As we went around the table, we realized that we all knew each other in general, save for one person. We'd all spoken probably in meetings together. We'd all heard the points of view, and so we had this rather unusual situation, which I will say is, Bruce, not like a car, but a little like a boat, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. So after getting to know each other, not really, we identified what was in the guide and what wasn't, and we realized that that was an opportunity and also a limitation. So we used the information that we had to construct a general framework, and I want to actually just mention a couple things that we did procedurally, only because we tried something and it almost worked. And that was, we started out with a bunch of blank slides in a PowerPoint that was projected up on the wall. And then we did that sort of parking lot thing where we had a whole bunch of ideas and we put them in the parking lot. And then we made 7 slides with each of the appropriate headings. And then we started taking the things we talked about and trying to figure out where they went best in those 7 parking spaces. And that actually got us back on task after we had discussed a whole myriad of things. And we wrestled with performance measures and checklists and a bunch of different things. And we tried to keep ourselves from getting too wound up in the fact that some of the things we really needed weren't in the guide. So we ignored what wasn't in the guide. And so we used, convention and best practice and had a lot of professional judgment around the table. But in this particular instance, I thought that this group reminded me sort of animal care programs, which remind me of something else, and that's a boat. And the reason I say this is because, unlike a car, you don't steer a boat, you correct it. Because it's going to go where it wants to go, and if you want it to go someplace else, you slowly but surely make crucial adjustments. And that critical nature of making those small but crucial adjustments helps to keep that boat on track. And so maybe our animal care programs and our committees that are developing best practices are more like boats than cars. So I think that that sort of parking lot, boat analogy, all these are all vehicles for us to get to the same place. And that place is a good balance between those performance standards that we'd like to have and the engineering standards which we do have. And the only thing that I think we all maybe felt around the table is that performance standards are sometimes necessary, but sometimes the engineering standards are pretty doggone good too. And we might want to consider a good balance between those. So anybody else from our group have anything to say? It's a great group. We appreciate the opportunity.
Let's give our presenters a warm felt round of applause. It's always a challenge when you think you're going to be in the audience and you're happy to be in the audience, and then you find out you're now on program. So we appreciate you stepping up. I do not want to take away from the compare and contrast. However, I do want to offer anyone in the audience an opportunity to ask any questions to any of the presenters without getting into the discussion. We want to maintain the compare and contrast. But if there was something mentioned that you wanted to ask about, now would be the time.
Joe Newsom, University of Pittsburgh. Not so sure it's a question, but I sort of picked up a theme there that I haven't really heard people talk about, and I'd like to see if the panel would like to comment. It seems like when we're doing performance standards and we're going through this process, the need for excellent moderators. and leaders and train individuals to do that. And certain institutions have different resources to do that, like program development offices and things along those, people that do process mapping for a living. How do you think that you could incorporate those kind of resources into this process in the future? Anybody can comment on that.
I have something, I'd like to go back to the word culture, that actually for us, I should have said earlier that we needed to define some terms, and that's the taxonomy that Judy was talking about. Culture was not only the institutional culture, but the various cultures of the individuals who are coming to contribute to the animal care. Obviously, in our business, we have people all over the country, different languages and different experiences of their own. My feeling about education and training and so forth, and even the rest of it, is that if the culture isn't top down, if there isn't someone up on top saying this is the way it needs to be, that we do moderation, that we do have oversight, that we need to correct our boat at some point, the direction of the boat, then it isn't going to happen. If it goes askew, we're going to be in trouble. So the culture is still a major thing. In terms of training, if the CEO won't put up the money to go to a training forum of some kind, we won't be trained, or we won't learn how to do protocol review, or won't hear from the regulators, whatever it may be. That's the kind of moderation that I think is important, and it was imbued into people by networking with others.
I'm not sure whether your question was a little bit more around moderation of the discussion process that leads to performance, changes in performance and so on. And you're right, there are very professional people who I'm sure could be very useful. And if you have access to those people, then that may accelerate some of the progress that an IACUC can make. But I think if you have a really good committee, I don't think you should say we can't do this if we haven't got a facilitator, a professional facilitator. I mean, you know, I think, I don't think any of us in our room were professional facilitators, and whilst we had great moderators, they were very hands-off in many ways, and that was really quite nice because it allowed us to go to where we wanted to. And I think that's probably the skill, to allow, what I heard from all four groups was the ability to just spend a couple of hours chewing the cud over a topic without too much constraint, without somebody reining you in all the time and say, oh, well, we've got to move on to item 5 on the agenda. But so maybe the message is that IACUCs need to set themselves time to do this and make this a kind of like a single discussion item for a meeting, rather than it just being agenda item 5 on a 12-item agenda, and if we don't get on, we won't get home tonight, sort of thing. So that would be my thinking, I think. But if you can get a professional to help you, so much the better.
Steve Nemi, Harvard University. I want to thank the organizers for emphasizing discussion on the process this morning as well as the outcome. I think from yesterday and through this exercise, we have reminded ourselves how hard this is, and how thoughtful and thorough people have to be. I hope that doesn't dissuade others from considering performance standards, because it does involve a significant investment of time, which we don't have. But it's certainly worth doing. So I hope that message comes through as well. To Joe's question, one can anticipate, sadly, maybe one outcome of this where we have experts for hire who are now brought in to advise you on which performance standards you may want to consider, just like we have compliance experts now. Most corporations have a culture, the outsider has instant credibility, while the inside opinion doesn't matter, even if it's the same. So there's a compulsion to bring somebody in from the outside. And what I hope we don't see now is this army of expert advisors who will come in on a retainer or an hourly fee and facilitate, quote unquote, the process that you really need to undertake yourselves with pretty elegant and sophisticated conversations. I think all four panels had the benefit of years or decades of wisdom and experience and knowledge. Not every institution or scenario is going to have those resources, but let's hope that folks don't look at the easy way out and still think they've done the right thing.
Right. Anyone else? I had one question, and that was, kind of taking this funnel and bringing it down to the more specifics. And really asking any of the groups to talk a little bit about how difficult or where they were in trying to determine what metrics would be the metrics that would reflect the outcomes that they were desiring.
I'll take a quick stab at this. No, I can't show the slide. I spent part of my lunch hour doing that. At any rate, I think I felt we had a difficulty coming up with measurables, if you will, because of either a lack of understanding or a misunderstanding of the statement of task. And I think one of the things that would have been really helpful would have been to have some sort of a get-together where we really honed what the statement of task was, and then we went back and thought about it for a while and came to the meeting prepared. The other things that I think would have benefited us would have been the usual team building exercises to make sure that we're all comfortable with each other. I think we were, but I mean, that always helps. And then some sort of calibration. And you can do that in a number of different ways. Sometimes, for example, if you're trying to calibrate your IACUC, you might want to, every once in a while, run some scenarios with the entire IACUC and get them to comment on what they think the scenario means and how you would solve whatever the problem is. Hopefully the scenarios are unsolvable, and so therefore you'll get good discussion. But I think if we had had several of those things, our ability to come up with measurables in a short amount of time probably would have been a little bit better. But obviously that wasn't something we could do.
For our group on workplace safety, I think we had an easier time identifying the metrics for what the monitor would be seeing when they were doing the post-approval monitoring. We had a slightly more difficult time pulling back and then thinking about what the IACUC or the IO would need to see to know that the post-approval monitoring process was working. That was a little bit more difficult, but finding out some of the details that the monitor, identifying some of the details that the monitor would look at or ask about when they were doing their part, that one I think everyone was able to come to pretty quickly.
I think in group 3, again, the scientific flexibility, I think once we agreed on the definition and the overall reason for why a performance standard was needed, I think then the criteria came pretty quickly. Again, we focused on the 2 major points, is to focus on protecting and promoting animal welfare, at the same time reducing administrative and unnecessary bureaucratic burden. And so with that, it was kind of easy to see, well, we want to reduce the number of unnecessary amendments. We want to reduce the number of violations. We want to reduce the number of interventions and so on. So those things came fairly quickly, but we realized we couldn't get to those until we had a very good, clear definition right up front. So we spent most of our time there, and then it all flew.
I think it was mentioned about protocol gray areas and trying to reduce them. In training, when we are assessing training, it's very easy to quiz or give a test about or assess fact-based things. It's much harder to assess a skill and how to, you can regurgitate facts, but it's a skill that takes some experience. One can be exposed to it, but then it takes a while to know what to do. And as I'm looking at the topics we had, some of them are a little bit more skill-based, or I'm sorry, fact-based, a little easier to evaluate. It's with a protocol, we're looking at something that's brand new. It's not been done before. So it's going to be harder to assess that we've done a good job for it because it's not been done unless we were repeating for some other reason. With surgery, we've got that element of an animal in there, the human. It's not just a human factor at that point. The animal is going to contribute to the outcome in some fashion, depending upon the age of the animal and the condition of the animal and things like that. So to have metrics for each of these things is going to be a challenge based upon the term, it depends. And to add to that, I think it's, when I drive a car, I have to have a license for it, right? I have to have some training, but I think I can go out and buy a boat and just put it on the lake, and I don't have to have a license? And do I need training or what? Do I then? No, okay.
Depends on the state.
I think too, for training, we all agreed that the size and scope of the facility or the institution had a big hold on what type of metrics you could produce and how. I mean, if you have a very small institution, you can really monitor a lot more closely, have clear numbers very quickly.
I think one of the things that we realized fairly early on, and it made it easier for us, was we realized that just depending on hard numbers was not necessarily going to give us all the metrics that we wanted to have. And some of what we wanted was people's opinions and views and how was this working. So if you do as sort of survey well constructed, you can turn that qualitative data into something that's kind of quantitative enough for you to be able to see trends and so on like that. So once we got into that area, we still recognize the value of having some hard data. That's good to have, but don't confine yourself just to that, but think about other ways of gathering information that will help you understand what impact you're having. Okay.
Great. So we're ahead of schedule, which is always good. What I think we'll do at this point is take our break. It is now, let's go ahead and say 2:25, and we'll be back at 2:40. Okay, and we will pick up with our compare and contrast. Thank you very much.
So I couldn't be outdone, and I have my own slides, but I'm doing them selfishly because it kind of helps me keep my mind on what I just heard and making sure that we stayed on task. I was asked to compare and contrast the process that the teams went through to look at performance standards, and it brought me back to kind of the general thought, the words that are in the guide. And I actually have to congratulate the people who wrote the guide. While I pull it out and I use it and I think about what's in it, just in looking at performance standards, I find it really fascinating and quite amazing that they could come up with a set of performance standards for all the things that they did that are so inclusive and flexible, and really each program can tailor for their own use. I think it's just a sign of wisdom, and I really respect what they've done. You know, we all talked about how the important part of our performance standards were professional judgment. Flexibility has been the word of the 2 days, I think, and really creating, looking at the outcome and working toward an outcome together as a team. So I need a little order to my life. I need to kind of organize my thoughts around something, so I go back to project management because it's easy for me to just kind of outline what we're doing. So starting with the project in our teams that we worked on, in project management, you would think about, you know, creating your team, setting out a business plan, engaging your key stakeholders, getting buy-in from your institution. And I heard a lot about this. First of all, I heard that teams believe that diversity is valued in creating performance standards. And I found even in my own training team, the diversity that we had at the table and some of the stories that they shared, the experiences they had, and the knowledge they brought to our topic was really useful and unique. So, you know, Carol Clark told us some stories that I'll probably never forget just because it was a great example of what we were talking about. Also, our key stakeholders, they are so incredibly important, and it's really, it's nuts. Thank you. It's really quite amazing how many people were engaging programmatically to make a change or to move a program. So I really am struck by, first, how many people we work with, and then secondly, how they're overlapping Venn diagrams that we work with. So these people are being engaged from all sides with us, with our programs as we engage in these efforts towards performance standards. Additionally, communication is key. We have to keep talking to our key stakeholders, and I'll get to that in a second, but I really believe that one huge benefit to performance standards is that by engagement of your key stakeholders and bringing them forward, what you're actually doing is developing a cultural change, not checking the box, okay, we met the number 5 in that cage, but really, considering what's important about housing and developing a culture. So I believe this engagement of your key stakeholders and communication is important to the cultural changes that we're making. And I heard these teams talking about that. Now, I forgot, I was actually supposed to ask you guys to go back up there. So if you could move back up in your spots, I'd be grateful. Come on, I know you can do it. Dave said so. Also, that there's a significant amount of leadership required to do this. Not only, there needs to be an investment in the belief that the performance standards need to be made. And also, we learned that the regulations actually create some level of a baseline for our performance standards simply because they have to be integrated into the process. Thank you. Now, in the planning phase of it, we talk a lot about the outcomes and agreement of outcomes, the need for agreement, and the need for flexibility. And each program kind of had their own, or each person brought their perspective about what they needed, but collectively we had a great set of outcomes. And so it really drew on the collective knowledge of these organizations and the individuals. And I have to tell you, because I had training and it's an area I work in, I was absolutely delighted that I've recently written a guideline for our organization regarding performance standards for training programs. So what are we asking of our global training programs to deliver? And our group came up with the same important things as my team at GSK had, and it was so wonderful to hear them show value in the same things I had, and it was reinforcing to me that our program had kind of hit a mark. So there's probably a lot of value when we start creating these performance standards to invest in the knowledge and benchmark with other people about the performance standards we're establishing and get their input, feedback, and ideas. When you execute the performance standards, I think, sometimes we do pilot studies, right? And I find the execution part hard to talk about because they're each specifically a project. But I can say that I know that doing a pilot study can be a way to go, but also sometimes it's just jump in and